Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's double book talk, an exciting first for us here at Data and Society. The title of this double book talk is Challenging AI Hype and Tech Industry Power. I'm Tamara Kneese, Program Director of the Climate, Technology, and Justice Program here at Data and Society, and I will be your host, barring Wi-Fi connectivity issues, so we shall see. So this event is supported by Network Engagement Manager Ireti Akanarade and Associate Producer Tanika Onekikami. For those who are joining a Data and Society event for the first time, Data and Society is an independent research institute studying the social implications of data, AI, and automation. We produce original research and regularly convene multidisciplinary thinkers to challenge the power and purpose of technology in society. You can learn more about who we are and where we're headed on our website, datasociety.net. So we have very exciting guests today. We have Emily M. Bender and Alex Hanna, who are co-authors of The AI Con, as well as Karen Hao, author of the New York Times best-selling, by the way, Empire of AI. Dr. Emily Bender is a professor of linguistics at the University of Washington, where she is also the faculty director of the Computational Linguistics Master of Science program and affiliate faculty in the School of Computer Science and Engineering in the Information School. Dr. Alex Hanna is the director of research at the Distributed AI Research Institute, known as DARE, and a lecturer in the School of Information at the University of California, Berkeley, as well as an outspoken critic of the tech industry, a proponent of community-based uses of technology. Karen Hao is an award-winning journalist covering the impacts of artificial intelligence on society. She writes for publications including The Atlantic and leads the Pulitzer Center's AI Spotlight series, a program training thousands of journalists around the world on how to cover AI, something we really need in this very moment. So we'll be spending the next hour together. Let's get grounded and do a little bit of table setting. In these two new books, Emily M. Bender, Alex Hanna, and Karen Hao all explore how AI serves as a powerful marketing tool for tech giants who have a product to sell and profits to rake in. Both of the books serve as complements to one another and provide different perspectives as well as methodological interventions around the same issue, namely the relationship between the tech industry's push for what we call AI and tech oligarchs' increasing concentration of both wealth and political power. So maybe we should start out, particularly for audience members who have not yet had a chance to purchase and read both of your wonderful books. Can you each maybe give us an idea of what the central thesis of your book is and what compelled you to write it? Who are you writing for, and what are the main stakes of your argument? And maybe we will start with Emily and then go to Alex and then Karen.
Thank you. Thank you, Tamara, for that lovely introduction. I'm super excited to be here. In just a few words, I would say the main thesis of our book, honestly, is the title, right? The AI Con, it says it on the tin. But the general idea there is that these technologies that are sold as artificial intelligence, first of all, don't qualify for that term based on how we understand it from, let's say, science fiction or even the marketing. And also are actually not a coherent set of technologies. And we have lots to say about why it is that they look like more than they are, and why it is that they are being sold as more than they are. And as to why we wrote the book, I think it's really important in this moment for the broad public and policymakers and all kinds of decision makers to understand both what these things really are and what's at stake. And it's an attempt, hopefully, to heighten that understanding. Over to Alex.
Thanks, Emily. I want to also add that the term AI itself is a marketing term and always has been a marketing term. And it is actually quite recent that it is actually the marketing term of choice. We've been through prior eras of marketing terms of choice, be them big data or data science or machine learning. And the term AI, even in its earliest origins, have that kind of notion of marketing appeal all the way back from the founding meeting at Dartmouth College from 1956 by John McCarthy and Marvin Minsky. And this term is being used to sell a set of technologies that have some kind of are intended to evoke some kind of a machine intelligence, but that is not even well defined, scoped. It's being used to do a lot of harm under that cover.
And Empire of AI is it tells the inside story of OpenAI, but much more than that, it uses that story as a prism through which to explore this fundamental argument that I make that the particular conception of AI development that Silicon Valley has sought to pursue, which is this scale at all costs type of development, is very much a new form of imperial power, and these companies need to be thought of as new forms of empire. And the reason why I try to articulate this argument is because once you begin to understand that that is actually what is happening here, it becomes very clear that this particular dominant paradigm of AI development is not only hugely costly in terms of social, environmental, and labor harms all around the world, but it is also a threat to democracy. It is a threat to the fundamental ingredient that makes democracy work, which is people having agency to control and self-determine their own future. And throughout the book, I document many communities that, when they confront the empire, initially have that profound loss of that agency.
Yeah, thank you all for those answers. And I think this is such an interesting juxtaposition to think of AI as both a con and in many ways a scam, and an empire. It is something that really has a huge amount of real weight in the actual world and material repercussions for people and communities in their everyday lives. So can we talk a little bit about that relationship between AI is both a con and an empire, and how your perspectives fit together and build on each other in many ways? Because, I think it's no accident that many people are buying and reading your books in tandem with each other, and the timing is so perfect too. So maybe if we could start with Emily and Alex and then move back to Karen.
All right. So yes, I want to jump in and say Karen's book is amazing, and just so deeply reported, and sort of looking at the details of what's happening both inside OpenAI, but also all of the people around the world who are being impacted by it. And so on the question of relationship between AI as empire and AI as con, I think that you could build an empire maybe without a con, and you can do a con without building an empire. But I think that the scam or the false marketing behind the idea of artificial intelligence is a tool that helps the empire builders in their building. And I think it's important to read the books together. What we bring to the table, I would say, is basically a sharp needle to pop that hype. And Karen, meanwhile, is just documenting in such detail, such damning detail, really, sort of what's going on, and the empire, and not empirical, I need the adjective, the empire building forces that are at play.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think thinking about this is that's right. There's the relationship with the empire and the con is so interesting. Because first, defining what the con is. So the con of AI works at multiple levels. First, the notion that there is a synthetic media generator, these large language models predominantly, and then also other synthetic media generators, but specifically in language that makes us envision that there's a mind behind the synthetic media, and that is the first, parlor trick that's happening there. And this term intelligence is then used to signal that these companies, OpenAI chief amongst them, being the company that is building this kind of artificial general intelligence that can do X, Y, Z, all kinds of things to quote unquote benefit all of humanity. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is of the con is suggesting that there's a technology that's good at one thing and it can be good at a whole host of other things. So good at generating synthetic text, thus good at replacing social services, replacing wide swaths of people at work, replacing teachers, educators, nursing staff, doctors. So that's the second level of the con. And that third part of the con is the whole kind of anthropomorphizing um, sheen that goes over it, that there's a kind of the idea um, of an I or me thing in the way that we are supposed to interact with this, and that presents this kind of machine intelligence aspect of it. I think the con is really interesting in relation to empire because in the past, empires have gotten their way via the out the point of a rifle or the point of a sword. And the con in this way is much more ideational and ideological. And the con men are still would-be emperors. And it's a really nice kind of tie because one thing that Emily say and what we do in the book is point out that the emperor has no clothes.
I would super highly recommend everyone pick up the AI Con. I literally laughed out loud multiple times while reading in the cafe the book. And one of the things that we've talked about before, the three of us, is the role that experts versus journalists play in each documenting the phenomenon. Like for Emily and Alex, they were able to just straight out state based on their rich expertise they're able to call out the fact that, this technology breaks down. It's not what it's actually marketed as. It does not fundamentally do certain things that these companies do. And for me, as a journalist, like the thing that I try to gravitate towards is just presenting more evidence on what are the human stories, how are the communities actually interfacing with this. And so I do think that Empire and Con are both two really powerful frames for understanding what's happening right now. Not only does it illustrate that there are huge social, political, economic uh, challenges, and there's the terraforming of the earth, there's the exploitation of labor that is happening to produce this technology, but also that this technology does not work. And it is not, in any sense of the word, living up to how it is built. And both of these are intimately intertwined in understanding exactly how we should then counter what is happening right now.
Thank you, Karen. And that is such a perfect segue to thinking about this relationship between journalism and the practice that you went through of, interviewing hundreds of people, really doing this very in-depth investigative reporting over the course of years. And Emily and Alex both building on their academic knowledge and expertise and really synthesizing and pulling together so many academic arguments from across a variety of different fields and across history. So can you all maybe talk a little bit about the relationship between academic and nonprofit related research and journalism and what we can all learn from each other and how we can work together, particularly in this moment when all of our fields are under attack, both independent research institutes that are funded by nonprofits, by foundations, and by obviously the federal government, as well as thinking about how journalism itself has been really restructured by the con of AI. So yeah, I would love to hear maybe first from Karen this time, and then move back to Emily and Alex.
Yeah, one of the things that as a journalist, I often tell researchers is I can't necessarily write about things without your work. I mean, so originally, why I even started talking or thinking about AI as empire was because of researchers that were identifying the extraordinary parallels between AI and colonialism. So one of the first papers that inspired me was called Decolonial AI by researchers at DeepMind in Oxford, Marie-Therese Pang, William Isaac, and Shakir Mohammed. And it was only then that I felt like I had permission to actually pursue that argument and start doing what I do as a journalist, documenting that phenomenon. But without that kind of framework, that the scaffolding from the scholarship, I couldn't really explicitly do that myself. So it kind of enabled me to then go and search for the evidence and continue building out a thesis that had been laid. And that's one thing that I think is really has been helpful throughout my career as a journalist is constantly exchanging ideas with researchers and building on their work and having researchers give me both a vocabulary and a scientific grounding to then articulate certain arguments and link them to the stories that I'm seeing on the ground.
Yeah, I could go since we're going in reverse order. One of the things I think that is so helpful for us as researchers is having folks that have the flexibility in terms of journalism to go and do a lot more active on the ground research and talking and chatting with different people in different communities in the ways that researchers sometimes do, but maybe are much more constrained to do, just because we have to, get funding and we have to go and do this and we can't be on the phone all day, although sometimes we are anyways. And so that's a very helpful thing. And so Karen's reporting has been really critical in doing this, and it's looked a lot more like research. I mean, for one of the things that we cite, we cite your work heavily in the book, and especially in the work around data workers, your research around AI, your AI and colonialism series that you did for MIT Tech Review, in which you talk with folks like Oscarina and Moffat and these folks who have been eking out a living doing data work in their communities, right? And so that's something that's also very helpful. And we really benefit from other journalists like the folks over at 404 Media that are experts in doing FOIAs and doing the deep reporting work when it comes to what companies are up to. I mean, that's very important, this. And it really helps us build our own research, whether it's linguistic or sociological, and trying to think about how that is really supporting the arguments that we're making as researchers, and maybe also presents new research avenues to go and say, well, Karen reported on this. What if we did a deep systematic dive on this and thought about how to really see, how widespread these practices are?
And just to add to that, I think that, and this is overly generalizing, but it feels like there's a difference in incentive structures. So sitting in academia, we are incentivized to answer questions like, how does the world work? What is something about the way the world works that no one has known before, but what builds on what's gone before? And I feel like what's going on in journalism is not how does the world work, but what does the public need to know about what's going on in our world? And those two are very complementary views, but I think it shapes differently the kinds of questions that we can even get funding and support to go ask. And to your point before, Karen, about getting licensed based on what's happened with the people answering the question, how does the world work? I think there's a lot of really rich things in the space in between, right? So someone says, I think the world works this way. Here's the experiment that I'm running or the research that I'm doing. And then a journalist can go and say, yeah, and here it is in this context, in this context, in this context, and it's important to the public for these reasons. And these are hugely synergistic to each other. And on the flip side, when academics are saying, okay, what's the next question I'm going to answer about how does the world work? It is very helpful to know what's going on in the world right now, especially if we want to point our research in directions that are going to be impactful to people's everyday lives.
So thank you all for that. I have a question about the cutting room floor. So, you all did so much research, so much writing, and yet, as I know very well, when you come to the end of a project, there are always a few strands that have to kind of fall away as you put the book together as an object in the world. And so, are there areas that you would like to explore in the future? Are there certain threads that you weren't able to fully develop in your current book? And this is definitely not a question about, what book are you writing next, because I would never do that to you all. But yeah, feel free to jump in, whoever is moved.
I want to start here just first of all to share that our cutting room floor actually is a file named Sleeping Kittens. And this was something that Alex instituted to make it easier to let go of those things that weren't quite fitting. Yes, literally, it's in our markdown file. And part of what was happening there was as we put things together, there were some things that just got too far into the weeds. And there was stuff where I really wanted to go on and teach the world about a linguistic lesson. And Alice was like, not here, Emily. And I did the same thing to her about points about political economy. But some of the Sleeping Kittens made it into the end notes. And so there's places where we like the point, but it really was interrupting the narrative flow. And so to readers of the AI Con, I strongly encourage you to check out the endnotes. We cite all of our sources, and we've got some extra little kittens that are barely awake that we have put there for you.
Yeah, there's a few things. I'm literally looking at the file now, and I think it's it's great to see. Yeah, so some of the things around political economy, I think that we really want to go into a lot of the stuff around labor. I think were very important for myself to have, but then are sleeping kindly in there. I would say a lot of things around science as well and the production of science. And I think one of the things, and we talk a lot about this in chapter 5 of our book, it is the way that science is done and the way that it's been misimagined in the AI boosterism debate. And so, if anyone has had the misfortune of reading the AI 2027 document, there's kind of a discussion and development of an AI scientist that can do research autonomously. And Karen, you talk about this a bit in your book as well. But it's not just OpenAI doing this. There's a whole host of companies doing this, and there's a lot that we could write about this as researchers that we really want to go down this rabbit hole of, but didn't get a chance to.
I absolutely adore the Sleeping Kittens. That is the best name ever. There were a lot of things that I had to cut out of my book. Anyone who's bought a copy of my book knows that it is already really long. And the audiobook itself was almost 20 hours, which is way longer than the average book. The things that I wanted to explore that I didn't get a chance to, I originally wanted to do the full supply chain of both AI development and deployment, look at all of the things that go into the technology and then what comes out to really juxtapose, look at the massive costs and look at the middling track record of benefits and also many other harms that this particular Silicon Valley's conception of AI is causing. And I simply just ran out of time and space because I realized one, this is a story that needs to be told now. To Emily's point earlier, like she's absolutely right that the journalism world, the incentive really is what does the public need to know and what do they need to know now? And the added benefit of trying to put that stuff in just was outweighed by the cost of spending another year doing that reporting and research and documentation. Um, the other thing that I realized was in order to keep it a focused story, because ultimately I tell this story through OpenAI, it was better to focus on the supply chain, which is the part of the technology that is often least talked about, and the one that OpenAI had the most impact on transforming and blowing up in terms of how expansive and costly it has become. So that was ultimately the choices that I made. But there were I got that there was about half a chapter that I wrote that I actually just deleted because on the deployment side because it just was not it didn't make it, but still some stories that I'm holding on to for maybe future projects.
Fantastic. Honestly, we have so many amazing questions that are formulating in the Q&A tab that I think we should just leave as much room for audience Q&A as we can. So everyone's ready to pivot there. I'm good with that. So there's one question that immediately struck me, which is from Alexa Haggerty, which is, can you talk about how notions of intelligence are at the heart of both historical and ongoing forms of colonialism and the emerging empire of AI? This seems like a really interesting convergence of con in the most violent sense and empire.
Yeah, absolutely. What a fantastic observation and question. And I mean, in the icon, we talk about this pretty extensively, this notion of intelligence and how this notion of intelligence is not something well defined in psychological literatures and certainly not well defined in AI literature. So we tell this kind of shibboleth, I guess is the right word here, is like of this is where Sebastian Bubeck, in writing the Sparks of AGI paper that was published a few years ago, it makes a reference to intelligence, and he references this. He and his co-authors make reference to this op-ed that's written by Linda Gottfredson, and that's titled something like 52 psychologists and other experts agreeing on some notion of intelligence. And that and that letter effectively is supporting the bell curve argument that there's race differentiated notions of intelligence that are innate. Um, and so this traces the long history of intelligence and intelligence testing, and how it's been a means of both promoting positive and negative eugenics. And that, of course, was a strong tool of colonization, the quote unquote white man's burden. And so, yeah, I'll let y'all respond on that.
I'll just add one thing, but I really do think Alex pretty much covered all of it, is one of the things that I talk about building on that idea of intelligence as an inherently hierarchical, imperial concept, or the idea that you can measure and quantify and rank intelligence is like an inherently imperial concept. It's also the reason why AI and AGI, artificial general intelligence, is just so poorly defined as a quest, because there is no scientific consensus on where human intelligence comes from and what is considered human intelligence and how to measure that. And so when companies gravitate towards certain benchmarks, those benchmarks are deeply coded based on their worldview of what is valued in society and also what's going to make them the most money. And so that is something to just, when you encounter AI tools and AI benchmarks and all these things, to be just deeply skeptical of, because all of these are choices that were made by someone with a very, I would argue, narrow world view of how the world works and how it should be.
Just want to add a quick linguistic twist to this, which is the way that language plays into perceptions of intelligence and what's happened in colonial contexts with language. And so part of the con is that we see the synthetic text coming out of the machines. It's also very tuned to the prestige varieties of languages, or will sometimes cosplay as non-prestige varieties, but only when sort of explicitly asked to do that. And so that sort of raises the thing in our esteem in a way that it shouldn't, because of the way that we're reacting to language. And then flip side, I'm sure many people have had the experience of traveling somewhere where you don't speak the language and feeling like people are not seeing you as fully human. And this is something that absolutely happened in spades in when colonizers came in and said, people who can't speak our language are not fully human. And then you end up with language varieties that are further stigmatized and associated with lower, in quotes, intelligence. And so I think that plays in very much in the artificial systems, and then also the connections to empire.
Yeah, we have another pretty popular question in the chat that dovetails with the reference to AGI that we just had. So from Nathalie Maréchal from CDT, we have, how do AI industry leaders reported adherence to some of the beliefs that Jabru and Torres called the test rail bundle factor into your analysis? Does it matter whether Altman, Musk, Zuckerberg, and co. actually believe that our descendants will be transhumans living in outer space? Does it matter whether they really believe that superhuman AGI is just around the corner and will fix anything, versus they know it's BS, but build value propositions on that claim anyway? So how cynical should we be, I guess?
Let me jump in quickly to say, I think it matters anytime a decision maker takes those ideas seriously. And to the extent that someone speaking in earnest and relaying these textual ideas is more convincing, then it matters that they believe it.
Yeah, I would sort of just add on to this, because I think there's kind of an element in which um, the test real ideas, I think, are very prevalent, and like there's a distinction between people who are kind of true adherents of them, your Yudkowskis and your um, the author of the AI 2027 thing, who's very rationalist, Kulta Talo. Um, and I mean, these people are still very much embedded in these organizations. So, he was at OpenAI, and Kurzweil was at Google. And I mean, these folks are in kind of the heights of power in these organizations. And even if people are not necessarily adherents, there's enough interest convergence with kind of the ideologies that it is a helpful thing for the kind of empire building and the corporate monopoly construction and the attacks on democracy, right? And I think that's very important to signify, right? Um, there's kind of a helpful essay in the Dean Society Ideologies of Control series that I'll put out that Gil Duran wrote today that was about the network state idea. And the state idea is it's very out there for sure. But the network state idea is also one that's being put into practice, whether it's just, it's a network state now, but back in the day, it was the company town. And so, they have their adherence, and even if they're just taking dribs and drabs of them, it still makes a lot of sense from a very particular libertarian point of view.
Yeah, I'll just add one more thing, which is that transhumanism is, Torres has mentioned this many times, is fundamentally an anti-humanist ideology. And so absolutely it matters that this is the vogue school of thought, the vogue ideology that everyone ascribes to, whether, as Emily pointed out, whether it's a true belief in it or whether they're just continuing to fan the flames of its popularity and continuing to platform it. And that is also why it is an inherently anti-democratic ideology as well, because democracy is built on this beautiful philosophy that all humans have a fundamental agency, and a right to be able to determine how to live a dignified life. And if you're talking about transhumanism, which is basically just replacing humans, I mean, like who ultimately, how can people who want to do that also believe that everyone should have agency and have dignity?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Alex, for bringing up the importance of the network state as a particular concept and ideology in terms of these things that seem very lofty in the way that transhumanism does, but is very much having real impacts on people and their lives. And if you're building company towns around the concept of the network state, or buying up real estate in the Tenderloin, or trying to expand and take over the Presidio, and make it no longer be a national park and move it into the territory of AI innovation that is completely unbridled. That has a very real impact on people. And so these things that do seem to be ideologically remote are often having real world impacts. So we've been, having a fairly critical conversation, but we do have a question in the chat that could point us towards perhaps a more liberatory use of AI in the future. So Alice Marwick, our director of research here at Data and Society, says, given that at this point it seems unlikely that Gen AI is going away, is it possible to imagine a just AI? What would each of you like to see AI develop into or become? Or is AI abolition still a viable position?
I want to jump in and say AI abolition is still a viable position. And these discourses of it's inevitable and it's going to be good, it's inevitable, it's going to be bad, or it's here to stay and we have to deal with it, are all basically either, the first two are an attempt by industry to steal our agency. And the third one feels very defeatist to me. I think it's very important to maintain that refusal is an option and we have that agency. And I think that there are certainly beneficial uses of automation. And we point actually to the same example. I think everyone loves to point to the example of Te Hiku Media in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the way that the folks there have really maintained community stewardship of their data and used it to build services that are useful for the Te Reo Maori learners and shielded it from being extracted by big tech forces. And so it is possible, but I think it never helps to start by calling it artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence, as we said at the beginning, is not a clear term. It's a marketing term. It doesn't refer to anything coherent. So yes, we can automate, but let's do specific automation so that we can scope the technology well, and we can be careful about it being technology that serves the people who are most impacted by it, rather than serving the people who want to make money off of it.
Yeah, this plus one AI abolition for sure. I think a few things in that. I mean, I think first off, when we talk about AI kind of with the out the quotes, we think about more as a field of action. And thinking about it from that perspective, um, the, AI shouldn't be, is not inevitable. And AI, as it is constructed right now, is, I think, fundamentally anti-democratic, which is a point that I think Karen makes very forcefully in her book. And so the way that it is, so one thing, I think trying to say that there's a notion of AI as it is formulated right now and suggesting that can be just is kind of counterintuitive or not, or rather counterproductive. And so I would want to put a stake in the ground right there. And I think I've been going, I dropped the classic Ursula K. Le Guin quote on an event once when I was saying, at one point, capitalism seems like it's, going to be here forever, but at some point, so did the divine right of kings. And getting back to the empire fact of this, this has only been a technology and an industry that's been around for 5 years. Why should it be something that we have to deal with for the next 50? Um, so yeah, I would just reject that out of hand.
I think I'll say two things here. One is like, how can we resist the current technology and change course, but also like, where do we change course to? And to kind of add on to what Alex was just saying with this harkening back to empire. I mean, one of the features of empire is they're made to feel inevitable, except throughout history, every single empire has fallen. And the reason is because as much as they seem strong, they're very weak at their foundations because they are built off of extraction and exploitation. And ultimately, that is why throughout history we have shifted towards a more inclusive form of governance, democracy, because people inevitably do not stand for being exploited and extracted over the long term. And so, in order to shift the current trajectory of AI development, I very much think about the full supply chain of AI development and deployment and how all of the ingredients that are used to build this technology, the data, the land, the energy, the fresh water, and all of the sites that these companies need to have access to deploy their technologies, schools, hospitals, government agencies, these are all individually and or collectively owned by people that are not Silicon Valley. I mean, Silicon Valley has done a very good job over the last decade in convincing people that their resources are actually Silicon Valley's resources, but they're not. That data is our data. That intellectual property is the intellectual property of artists, writers, and creators. That land is communities' land, and those schools are collectively owned by teachers and students. And one of the remarkable things that has happened in the last year or two is the recognition of many different communities that were harmed in the process of the deployment and development of this technology that are now actually actively trying to reclaim their ownership over that resource, over that space. So we're seeing artists and writers sue these companies. That is them reclaiming ownership over that data, over that IP. We're seeing hundreds of communities around the world resisting data centers and their consumption of fresh water resources in water scarce areas. We are seeing teachers and students starting to actively talk about, wait a minute, like, why are we accepting AI in our schools? And if we do actually want to, under what terms should we accept it so that it continues to foster curiosity and critical thinking instead of eroding it? And I think if we like I see these all as sites of democratic contestation. And if we see 100,000 times more of that democratic contestation on all along the supply chain, we will start seeing the trajectory of AI development change course. And where do we want to change course to? I'm very much an advocate of task-specific small AI systems that are targeting well-scoped computational problems that AI is actually designed for. And I think there are three benefits to doing this approach. One, we do not have the extraordinary consumptive scale of the everything machine approach to AI development. Two, it is no longer, I mean, marketing something as an everything machine is inherently harmful because ultimately research has shown time and time again that it's not an everything machine. It is a machine that does some things for some people, but inevitably you will have many people who don't understand what the limitations are and will start using it in ways that the technology is not designed for, such as asking it for medical information. It does not do that. And so if you have task-specific machines, it becomes much more clear to the consumer what they should actually be using it for. And then the last benefit of this approach is that also companies, like when I speak with OpenAI researchers, they say, well, it's impossible for us to anticipate all the different ways that this technology could be abused and harm people. Well, yes, obviously, because you're trying to market this technology as being able to do anything. But if you actually scope the problem and give bounds to where this AI should be deployed, you will, in fact, be able to imagine much better in advance what are the ways that this can break down and then mitigate those risks beforehand.
Yeah, I think your point, Karen, just now about keeping the scope of AI within bounds relates to a question that popped up. And it's something that, of course, I personally and selfishly want to talk about. So a question from Liz Cantor Courtwright says, I have two very newbie questions. One, could you please address the climate energy impacts of the explosion of AI? Is most of the impact in training models or in using them or both? And there we can talk about the supply chain for sure. And then this question of the control of resources by Silicon Valley. And I think the relationship between environmental sustainability and sustainability in other ways. So we're thinking about what it means to lead a good life and have a future for all of us collectively. So is this an unsustainable financially bubble being kept afloat by venture capital, or will it truly be profitable? Will the bubble burst? And so I think we can really connect both of these questions to the point that you just raised, if anybody has any thoughts about this particular problem.
I can jump in and address the first part of the question with just a stat. There was recently a McKinsey report that came out showing that at the pace of current development for the expansion of data centers and supercomputers, which refers to both the training and the deployment of these AI models. In the next 5 years, we would need to add 2 to 6 times the amount of energy consumed annually by the entire state of California onto the global grid to support just the data centers and supercomputers that are being built for this massive AI imperial project out of Silicon Valley. That will mostly be serviced by fossil fuels because these data centers have to run 24/7, so they cannot run exclusively on renewable energy. And we do not have the nuclear fission capacity, and we do not have nuclear fusion in existence. Sam Altman just recently testified in the Senate and said as much. He said most probably it will have to be through natural gas. And he was picking the nicest fossil fuel, but there has already been reporting that shows that coal plants, they were meant to be retired and they're literally being extended because of this data center development. We've seen stories about the way that Musk has built XAI, his giant supercomputer named Colossus in Memphis, Tennessee, and that is running on around 35 unlicensed methane gas turbines pumping thousands of tons of air pollutants into that community. So it's not just a climate crisis, it's also a public health crisis. And Bloomberg recently had a story showing that this data center expansion has 2/3 of those data centers are being built in water scarce areas. So it's also a fresh water crisis. And these data centers don't just use fresh water, they also use drinking water because that is the infrastructure that cities and towns have available to deliver fresh water to buildings. And so one of the things that I document in my book is the literal competition of these data centers for fresh water with communities that are already lacking it.
Yeah, and I would just add on to that and just say, I mean, there, Karen's original reporting has been fantastic on this. There's, in addition to making it a carbon crisis, a water crisis, there's also a crisis of small air particulates and air pollution. So, um, research from Chalet Ren out of UC Riverside's effectively shown that because of the SLAs, that the service level agreements that data centers provide, that it has to have 99.999% uptime. It's not only that it has to be connected to the grid, but there have to be a fleet of backup diesel generators to ensure that these data centers stay up. So in places like Data Center Alley, like in London County, Virginia, like in around now this kind of rash of data centers being built around Atlanta and Decatur County, just northeast of here, where I'm in Columbus at my sister's house in New Albany, Ohio. These are areas that are typically lower income and also having kind of this rash of data center development. And these areas already may be presenting with excess deaths from respiratory illnesses from that air pollution. So it's already happening right now. Um, and that's quite alarming. There's this thing I wanted to quote from Karen's book, which is just the dedication, which I kind of love, and I think it was sort of what this initial question was getting at. Like, what about if we're not if we're not pursuing these things for the advantage of all humanity? What are we missing out around? And the dedication is to the movements around the world who refuse dispossession in the name of abundance. And when I was reading that, I read that, it gave me chills. I thought that was such an amazing thing. Who right now is being dispossessed for the promise of this AGI, post-capitalist, fully automated future that's never going to come, right? That is depriving people of home and hearth, of traumatizing them through data work. What is being done to scar people in the here and now? And it is these assertions from Altman, just getting back to the fusion thing, that we're just going to have fusion. And Tamara, you were on our podcast when we were reading that piece, the interview with Altman, when he just asserted with no evidence we're going to have fusion. This thing that is not on the technical horizon anytime soon. Um, and yeah, you're going to be relying on these dirty forms of energy, these power plants in West Virginia, these coal-fired power plants, which have not who have are not being decommissioned. The purchasing energy from Three Mile Island, Meta buying and a nuclear from Constellation, and there's a whole, which is a nuclear energy provider. So these whole host of examples of communities being dispossessed in the here and now for this magnanimous empiric future.
And I just want to add on to that. It's hard to follow Alex quoting Karen, but to add that one of the things that we frequently hear is that, from like Eric Schmidt, for example, we shouldn't try to work on the climate crisis. The only thing we can do now is to go all in on AI and hope that the AI will solve it for us. And that is absolute nonsense. It is built on misunderstandings of what's actually needed in the face of the climate crisis. We don't need some new technology. We're not going to technology our way out of it. We need political will. We know what we need to do. We just have to do it and work on the sort of social systems that would allow us to do it, and also allow us to have humane systems in place for the climate refugees who are going to need places to be. And to say, well, it's hopeless, and our only hope is that somehow the enormous synthetic text extruding machine, if we just give it more data, is going to combust into consciousness and solve this problem for us, is absolute magical thinking, and we should not let them get away with it.
Yeah, thank you. So there have been so many great questions in the chat. It's hard for me to sift through them and choose. But building on the conversation we were just having about data centers and the environmental and social and public health implications of AI and their related infrastructures, there's a question from Paul Lara in the chat around Mexico. So they write, Mexico is now a slave to AI data centers, and governments don't understand the risks, and journalists don't keep up with the news because of their close ties to companies and their own vested interests. What can we do as journalists who are interested in sharing this truth, but who are sometimes censored? And I know, Karen, that this is something that you've also been working on separately, thinking about connecting local journalists and researchers to the needs of communities on the ground. So how can we amplify some of the stories and some of the harms that are happening in a way that creates some mechanism for accountability?
One of the things I talk about in the epilogue of my book is that empires, the reason why they feel so powerful is because they ultimately have overlapping monopolies on many different things, one of which is a monopoly on knowledge production. And this is why there is so little ability for governments to even know what the impact of a data center will be, because when they ultimately try and consult experts, it turns out that most of these experts are actually being paid by companies that have a vested interest in getting those data centers built. And this person's question also pointed out that there can also be vested interests within journalists who are covering it as well. And so one of the things that I have very, very strongly felt in terms of part of the solution that we need to focus on is figuring out how to resource independent knowledge production. You know, I often point to Data and Society as one of those places that is doing that independent knowledge production. Also, universities doing that knowledge production. Timnit Gebru's DARE. And of course, Alex is also part of DARE doing that independent knowledge production. But we obviously need way more of that. And journalists are also part of that knowledge production outside of the empire that is able to then produce that the basis upon which people can resist and fight back against certain imperial narratives. But to this person who was asking the question's point, like we are at a moment where, and Tamara, you mentioned this too, like we're at a moment where a lot of these different institutions are in crisis all at simultaneously. And I had an event just a few days ago with the Pulitzer Center where one of the things that I called for is we really need to start figuring out new innovative ways of working together so we can share our resources so that we can do more with less. And that means journalists collaborating more across borders. One of the things that I've been really interested in is trying to build a global network of journalists who are covering data centers so that we can share tactics and tips with one another and not continuously having to relearn how to cover, how to investigate data centers when actually all data centers are basically doing the same exact thing, regardless of what country they're in. Also, how can we partner more with research organizations so that all of us are ultimately moving forward in the same direction and continuing to raise the floor on the knowledge that everyone has access to? And I don't have the answer for really what that's going to look like, but I guess this is like a call to everyone here dialed in with us today to think about that. What are new, innovative, collaborative forms of essentially building power among all of the different organizations, communities, institutions, civil society groups, such that we can have that independent, scientific, grounded knowledge production that helps put a reality check on all of the crazy things that these companies say?
And what we can do as non-journalists in this space is to seek out the journalists doing excellent work and support their work. And supporting their work could be subscribing to the publications where they publish, or making sure your library has subscribed, or even just reading and sharing and making other people aware of it. There is so much noise that is coming from so much money behind the venture capitalists, but we all have voices. And I think I encourage everyone to use it as much as they are able and comfortable.
And just plus oneing all that. I mean, we talk about a little bit about journalism in the book, specifically about how, I mean, the problem has been about I mean, the industry of journalism is also under attack. And, just I was thinking a little bit about a story I heard on KQED in which they were talking about how Sonoma County is their local newspaper is being bought up by Alden Capital, which is colloquially known as the killer of newspapers, and the same time in which another network state is being installed there by Andreessen and company called California Forever. And so, which is a really ominous, weird name, and also a very empiric, like a very empire type name. And I mean, you think they would be more subtle about this, but it's just very much tying it to these manifest destinies sort of projects. And so, what are the types of projects that we could also focus on? And we're big fans of journalist collectives like 4 Media and Defector and Aftermath, and these organizations that are consumer and user subscriber based. Um, Although it's not going to completely reform the industry, we need sort of these collectives that are focusing on holding power to account.
So I'm going to try to collect as many questions as I have for the last couple of minutes that we have in my mind, and think about for each of you, what would you hope to have happen now that your book has been published and is out in the world? What Sorry, I'm at the airport right now. What do you hope for the future of your book, particularly in a moment where, within the US at least, we have a 10-year moratorium of AI regulation potentially on the table in a bill? And so, what, just quickly, what do you really hope that your book does in the world? What work do you want it to do?
So I'm always trying to bring hope. So even if we have that 10-year moratorium for state level regulation, policymaking happens in many different levels, right? You have school districts making their policies around the uses of technology, and no federal legislation that is restricting what states can do is going to change what a school district can do in that level. And what I really hope for with this book is that in the near term, it helps people who feel uneasy with all of this stuff happening under the label of AI and who understand it much better, especially after reading Karen's book, feel empowered and able to articulate their objections, both to themselves and to the people around them. And then in the longer term, we tried to write a book that would actually hold value in terms of helping people identify hype. And there's a line in here that I like: help people recognize the glib marketing that power cloaks itself in.
Yeah, I would say that. I mean, I would love that if the book is in the power of many different people. So we wrote the book with the intention of having in the hands of consumers, of being able to pop the AI hype bubble and use ridicule as practice to notice all these things that are being advertised and poke holes in them. We'd also love it to be in the hands of workers and think about how AI can be used as a tool of holding basically as a cudgel against workers. And then even though the regulatory and legislative environment is very grim right now, it would be great if this gets into the hands of policymakers to really understand what's at stake here and what needs to be done. But unfortunately, that window is becoming smaller and smaller. So I think the way that we push back is collectively, as kind of worker and consumer collectives.
The thing that I always say, which is effectively exactly what Emily and Alex said, is even when we have a crisis of leadership at the top, the beautiful thing about democracy is we can have leadership from the bottom. And there's so much work that can be done, even if this moratorium passes. In fact, even more work to be done if this moratorium passes. And just remember, technology is not inevitable. It is made by humans who made certain choices. We are all humans that have choices, and every one of you has an active role in shaping the future of AI development.
Wow, what a note to go out on, everyone. So thank you all so much for joining us for challenging AI hype and tech industry power. And please do check back on datasociety.net in the coming days. We'll have the full recording up and all of the references from this conversation. So don't worry if you missed people saying things in passing or you need a link to something. We will share all of that with attendees. So please keep in touch with us and definitely pick up both of these books and read them.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you to Data and Society for bringing this beautiful space together for all of us to talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tamara and Ariti and Tanika, Data Society, and to Karen and to Emily.
And
Thank you all.